Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest in the series of NUITEQ Snowflake webinars. Tonight, we will be talking about inquiry-based learning. Again, we have Danielle Macklin, who will be leading our webinar. As always, if you have any questions, please put those questions in chat, and I will interrupt Danielle at an opportune time to share the questions with her.
Thanks, Jack. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for being here. I'm excited to teach you a little bit more about inquiry-based learning. We did a webinar not too long ago looking at how to use Snowflake for project-based learning. Inquiry-based learning follows similar ideas and can have the same results as students creating a project at the end, but the flow of it and the pedagogy is just a little bit different. So we're going to start first by talking more about what inquiry-based learning is, and we'll talk also about how to use Snowflake as a way to incorporate that into your own instructions. So a little bit of background on inquiry-based learning. So with inquiry-based learning, it is student-centered and it focuses on investigating an open-ended question or problem. So typically with an inquiry-based learning activity or lesson, there are no right or wrong answers. It's more of how do students come up with a solution, oftentimes a solution to a real world problem. And that is going to help drive their instruction and drive their learning. Much of inquiry-based learning is based off of using evidence-based reasoning. So students examine or different sources or conduct different experiments and then use the evidence from that to come up with a solution or an answer to their open-ended question. The really great thing with inquiry-based learning is it allows the students to process content in different ways. So what that means is it already has kind of built-in differentiation. So students who are very visual learners or students who learn best by doing like the hands-on type things, depending on the inquiry itself, it can help reach multiple different learning styles and different learning needs. And in a true inquiry method, students will come up with their own questions, research, and solution and drive their focus of learning kind of all on their own. We'll get to how to go from a very guided inquiry-based learning to something that is incredibly open for students. One of the biggest benefits of using inquiry-based learning is it provides students with an opportunity to have ownership of their learning. So when they are invested, when they are making it about something that they're interested in or something that they have kind of an authentic buy-in to, it's going to make students more open to learning, and they're going to have that higher level of, like, I always call it grit. So that tenacity of wanting to really make sure that they're following through with everything that they're trying to achieve in the inquiry assignment itself. And then they also will get a lot of that pride of having successfully solved their problem or answered their question because it's something that becomes more meaningful for those students. So the way that inquiry-based learning can be set up, and I'm using a Snowflake arrange activity as the way to explain this a little bit more. This arrange was really great because it flows kind of like a timeline, and I thought this would be very helpful in talking about the levels of inquiry and then how to use inquiry-based learning in your classroom, so the procedural part of it as well. So when we talk inquiry-based learning, we are talking about it is a very question-driven task. So it's a learning style where, like I said, students will be solving real-world problems or answering questions or coming up with a solution. So from a teacher-centered approach all the way to a true open student-centered approach, we're going to look at the different levels of inquiry-based learning. The first is confirmation inquiry. So in confirmation inquiry, this is where students are going to follow the teacher's lead. So the teacher is going to provide direct instruction of a particular concept. They're going to be the one who poses the questions to the students, and then the teacher will model the process of how to reach a end result, so how to reach the solution. So everything is very guided by the teacher. Students typically will work on this type of confirmation inquiry together as a class, and typically will kind of come to similar end results. So it's much more teacher focused and teacher centered with direct instruction, and less open for students to kind of do their own thing. The next level is structured inquiry. So in structured inquiry, the teacher's still providing a lot of guidance. So they're creating those starting questions, those starting inquiries. They're modeling the process. So they would be the ones who perhaps choose the topics that students would be researching or experimenting. They're also the ones who are going to provide the students with the appropriate resources that they would need in order to analyze those resources to reach their solution or their answer. The students in a structured inquiry model are going to be responsible for collecting the data. So they'll be looking at the resources provided and they'll be researching it and then analyzing their findings. But they're having it in a very, as it says, structured model. So they're using what the teacher has provided for them. As we get closer to a more student-centered approach with guided inquiry, this is when the teacher is going to provide the starting question, but the students are going to have more ownership of the process of research, and their students will have more ownership over the presentation of their discovery or of their solution to that open-ended question. So this teacher has that kind of more of a backseat role. So they're still kind of starting off with that question, but students are coming to a solution on their own. And then in the most student-centered approach is open inquiry. So with open inquiry, this is when students are going to choose their own topics. They're going to come up with their own questions. They're going to be responsible for conducting their own research. And they're also going to be the ones who will present their findings and their solution to whatever the inquiry had been. So in this, the teacher's role is mostly to provide the time for students to do their inquiry and to help assist with any troubleshooting that they might have along the way. But it's very much the student-driven approach to it. So if you're interested in your classroom of providing inquiry-based learning opportunities for your students, whether or not you go from something that is a confirmation inquiry to structured, guided, or going full into an open inquiry, there's different steps that you can take within your class to help provide students with the support and the resources they would need. So that brings us to our next one. So how do we incorporate inquiry-based learning? So with that, the first part is to pose a question. Put that on the right line. So that question could be a question that the teacher introduces to the entire class, or it could be questions that the students come up with on their own, depending on the unit of study. So it always begins, inquiry always begins with a question. The next step is to investigate. So this is the part where students will be conducting their research, and depending on how close to student-centered or teacher-centered you're using an inquiry-based learning activity, the investigating part could be students are kind of just given the time and they're responsible for finding their own sources, versus as the teacher providing them with the materials and the research that they would need, and then students analyzing. The next step in that is to interpret. So in the interpret step of inquiry-based learning, this is when students have an opportunity to start explaining their solutions using the evidence. So explaining their thought process, explaining the answers to the question, or explaining the solution to whatever problem they were attempting to solve. This is a really great step, and it allows students to generate those new thoughts and those new ideas, to propose new theories based off of what they had been researching. And it also is going to give students an opportunity to explain any new knowledge and new discoveries that they made along the way. So this is the part where you're going to get those really great aha moments that we as teachers love seeing in our classroom. So when students have a chance to kind of really digest that research and analyze that research, that's when they get to come to those conclusions. and it really makes that learning a lot more meaningful. So this is where you do get a lot of that extra buy-in from students, because now it's something that becomes very personal to them. They've come to that answer on their own. The next step is presenting. So this is when students have the opportunity now to share the information. So they get to share what they have discovered. They have an opportunity to elaborate on their discovery. This present part could be a project that students have created. It could be just a discussion. It could be a paper. So depending on either what you want students to produce or how much structure you're providing in this inquiry-based model, the present part is where students just have a chance now to share what they've learned. This is also a really great time for students to start making those connections to new ideas. So looking back and saying, oh, this reminded me of something else we had learned, or this is sort of like another thing we had learned. So they get to build those connections. And by building those connections, they're able to store a lot of that new content information into their long-term memory. So that, of course, is obviously, a big goal for anyone teaching, is once you can get that new information and new skills in long-term memory, students will be able to recall it much easier. The last step in providing inquiry-based learning, and this is an optional step. So this depends a lot on how you want to structure your inquiry model in your classroom, but that's the opportunity for reflection. This is a chance for students to go back and maybe go back to their investigate part of their inquiry, so of their research. Maybe they need to revise just something that they tried in an experiment, or they want to look back at different examples of evidence and see if that's going to apply. So they can have that opportunity to step back a little bit, reevaluate, rethink. Or it's also an opportunity, if you want to end there, it's an opportunity for students to talk about what went well in their inquiry model, what would they do differently, what were their challenges, providing them the opportunity to reflect on how well they learned during this particular task. As a teacher, it would be a great chance for you to get feedback from your students. And then for the students, it's a really great opportunity for them to start thinking more about what are the learning styles that work best for me. So what am I most successful with? Where do I still have challenges? And how can I overcome some of those challenges? So those are the steps to incorporate inquiry in your classroom. And I'd like to share with everyone some different lesson activities that we have from the Snowflake community that have already been created that would help you bring in more inquiry-based learning into your own classroom. A lot of inquiry-based learning follows that idea of the scientific method. So I want to share this one lesson. So this would be great, obviously, for a science classroom, but this could also be modified in many different ways, depending on what you teach and the level of your students. So this can be searched in our Snowflake community. It's titled Scientific Method, Editable Template, Research, Record, Display. So in the 5 rounds with this particular activity, students would go through the cards. This would be a tool that you could use to send to your students, and students could then edit the lesson activity in their Snowflake.live classes and then share that with you as kind of their product. So that present phase of the inquiry model, they could share back what they've recorded on this. So you can see there are different questions. Students could write their information. All of this can be edited, of course. The next round asks questions and make hypotheses. So this is where you get those ability for students to start driving forward that inquiry-based learning, making their hypothesis. So using prior knowledge, building a hypothesis, and then recording their thoughts on those additional cards. And then this is so great in following that inquiry base because it goes next into the research. So where are they finding their information? What are they recording? So a way to keep track of everything as they're moving their research forward. And then if this were a science class, the ability to design an experiment. So what steps would they need to take? So they could use this as a brainstorming session, or they could use this as they're explaining that new knowledge and those new discoveries. And then lastly, their conclusions. What solutions did students come up with at the end of their inquiry? So this one is focused more on science, but it could easily translate into other subjects as well. Another Snowflake activity that we have that helps follow the inquiry-based learning model is creating and testing a theory. So this is another arrange activity. And this does follow the scientific method, but it can be modified to work in other subjects. So again, this kind of follows that, come up with your question. Oh, wrong spot, there we go. Make an observation, then come up with your question, and then go through the different components of inquiry-based learning. So brainstorming what they think would happen, coming up with their testable answer, their hypothesis, taking the results, making the predictions, that reflection opportunity. So this could be just a template that students would use to help remember that process as they're working through an inquiry-based learning activity. And then since we are approaching the holiday season and it is winter in many parts of the world and starting to get really cold, I found this great activity from our snowflake community about the hidden patterns of snowflakes. And I thought this was just a really great lesson activity that could be used in really any class as an opportunity for students to incorporate more inquiry-based learning. And especially, I know as we get into those times off before the Christmas holidays, and that little long break that many schools get in the winter, it's always hard to come up with what am I going to do those last couple days before my students go on vacation. And I think this would be such a fun activity to incorporate into your classroom as a way to just have kind of that fun winter spirit, even if you're in a place that doesn't get a lot of snow, and give students a chance to dive into a lot of inquiry learning and still have fun along the way. So in this particular activity, there are questions behind each card. So it would involve students looking at different images of snowflakes, talking a little bit about what they're seeing. So here you have kind of that early part. This would be a lot more toward that confirmation inquiry where the teacher's guiding those early questions. And then it goes a little bit deeper. So lay a string across the snowflake to make a line through it. So students could have little models of snowflakes and then talk more about what they see in those patterns. And this would be a really great activity to tie together concepts of science, concepts of math. You can even open it up to talk about geography and looking at areas that are getting different levels of snow versus areas that are staying really warm. So then we have some making predictions. So in this activity, students get a lot of opportunities. So here's our confirming. So this would be that presenting. Students are getting a lot of opportunities to test out different theories, to go back, research more, compare and contrast. So really great opportunities for presenting and for reflection. Looking at different examples, guess the snowflake that was made from the pattern behind the card. So we see some different fun examples. So just some fun activities to incorporate a little bit more inquiry. This does have a really great instructions on how to use this in your classroom, as well as additional materials. As you can see, we have some snowflake templates and links to other words, and it does tie into next gen science standards, which is fantastic. And this is in the snowflake community, just titled The Hidden Pattern of Snowflakes. So that was a lot today about inquiry-based learning, but I hope it's something that would be helpful and that you can consider using within your own classroom as well. It reminds me a lot when I taught my 6th grade students. We did a unit, and I know I've spoke about it before, but it was probably one of my favorite activities that I did. We did a whole, I think it was like a week or 2-week long inquiry into how did King Tut actually die, and my students investigated what may have happened. So it was very much a confirmation / structured inquiry model, where I kind of had everything ready for it. I found the lesson activity on just online and thought, like, this is perfect. I'm teaching ancient Egypt. So it was a perfect exercise. But my students were the ones who were really coming up with those questions based off of what they were examining. So looking at x-rays, looking at different historical accounts based off of evidence that was discovered in his tomb, and just really fun kind of combination of social studies, history with a lot of science thrown in, and my students having to come up with their solution of what happened to them. So it was a really fun activity, and my students really got into it. They were able to come up with some really great theories, and they used everything that with like support of what their evidence was. So they would say, but if you look at this x-ray of his leg, you can see this break here and break there. And it was great to have our interactive panel. My kids could come up to the board and just annotate over and make other students be like, oh yeah, okay, now I can see that. I didn't see it before. So it was just a really, really great learning activity for my students. And it made them look at history as like less of, it's just old things or, dates and kind of stuff that's just not changing, and look at history as like, oh, like there's always new things that happen when new evidence comes about. So it was a really fun activity that was a little inquiry based as well. So with all of that said, I'd like to open up for any questions that we might have about inquiry-based learning or how to incorporate that into your own classroom.
So we had a question that came in, and it was, could you think of any examples of how you would use this in elementary school?
Oh, elementary school would be fantastic. I mean, kids at that age too are so curious about everything. I think some fun ways that you could incorporate that would be something as simple as looking at how different colors can be created by blending the primary colors. So if you have, red, blue, and yellow, what other color combinations can you have? And having students think about what would they need to do in order to change one color from another color, and then having them use one of the snowflake lesson activities to show what they had learned by combining those different colors together. So that would just be kind of little science, a little bit of art. You could even incorporate some math skills into that, where students would maybe have to measure different like volumes of liquid to determine if I add, 5 milliliters of yellow to 10 milliliters of red, what color is going to appear. So it would kind of be a nice cross-curricular approach. And then as always, the ability to combine social studies with so many other subjects. Something like I mentioned about the King Tut activity that my students did, but really just using any kind of history, mystery type thing, or even introducing history in a way where students have to learn what exactly happened in this particular event by just providing them with like the tiniest little bit of information, and then having students come up with questions about that, and then researching the answers to those questions to learn more about that particular topic.
So as you've been talking, I've kind of been thinking about stuff that I used to do, and I'm not sure whether it's inquiry-based learning or not, so I'm going to ask you, the expert. When I was an administrator in a school in the suburbs of DC, a lot of my students were from Central America and would work as soon as they got out of school. So 12, 13 years old, they would go to work in constructions already. And a lot of them had come with no background in school and had a tough time with math, and would always say I couldn't do it. And so I'd always ask them, I would like tell them, why don't you do this for me? When you think you can't do it, I want you to go home tonight when you're doing your work with your dad or with your uncle and you're laying tile. How are you figuring out how much tile you need? So come back and tell me how you figured that out. And how are you figuring out how much paint you need to paint a room? Or how are you figuring out how much wood you need and to compare the tools? Tell me how that relates to math. Would that be inquiry-based?
Absolutely. And that would definitely help build a lot of those real world connections to what students are learning. So really just inquiry, the idea behind it is it starts with a question. So it could be a simple question, or it could be a question the kids come up with all on their own. And then it's coming up with the solution in their own way. So like relating building or painting to calculating what you would need for your materials, calculating the area of a room that you're going to paint and trying to figure out, making the conversions. When you provide those kind of opportunities, it does make it more meaningful to the students because it does give that real world connection for them.
Well, we don't have any other questions. We have one question tonight. We have a couple of comments saying thank you, and one saying I'm going to take this back and use it as professional development for my teachers. So that's good. Glad that can happen. Do you have anything else you'd like to add this evening?
Nothing for me. Just wishing everyone a happy holiday. We will be on a break until about January, and then we'll be coming back with a whole new set of engaging webinars. We look forward to seeing everyone join us again in the new year.
Happy holidays to everyone out there, and I hope everyone has a wonderful break. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.